Thank you for coming again tonight. For those of you here last night, for our first two speakers, we'll continue this week with two more excellent speakers, Hakeem Jefferson and Dr. Nathan Kalmo. Tomorrow night, we have Dr. Salim Al-Habash from the Michigan State University's Political Communications School, and Dr. Vincent Hutchings will be our closing speaker from the University of Michigan. That great honor. You know the drill, 30 minutes of each speaker, and then about 20-30 minutes of Q&A at the end for both speakers. And then there'll be extra time at the end where they'll meet with others who have specific comments. Thanks again. I know this is late, it's tough, but I'm really looking forward to these talks tonight. So please join me in welcoming Hakeem Jefferson to give his first talk. Thank you. Oh, I should say, I had this whole thing planned, I'm sorry. This is like his going away party, right? So he's going to Stanford very soon after this. So let's give him a nice send-off. And yeah, thank
you. That just means no tough questions. Let me make sure this is on. So thank you, Eric and Sandy and ICPSR for having me. I'm very honored to be here tonight to talk about this work with all of you. I'm very excited to share the stage with my friend and mentor, Nate Kalmo, who's brilliant, kind, and the best kind of scholar one could be. So I'm going first so that we can save Nate for last today. But I'm going to talk to you today about my dissertation project and this ongoing work that I've been doing to understand Black attitudes about punishment. And I'm going to talk about Black attitudes about punishment tonight through the lens of respectability. And I might use respectability and in-group policing sort of interchangeably because I want you to be thinking as I'm going through this talk about ways that this framework might be useful for some other groups that you might care a little more about. Hopefully all of you are as interested as I am in African Americans, but perhaps you're not. Hopefully we can find some ways in Q&A where this travels pretty neatly to other domains of interest. But I'm going to talk about African Americans tonight, and I'm going to start by noting that there are some remarkably stable features of Black politics, ones that are relatively familiar to many of us in the room. We know, for example, that African Americans consistently support the Democratic Party. And of course, all of you know that this isn't a recent phenomenon. This has been the case for quite some time, that African Americans, when asked about their partisan identification, upwards of 90% of them report an attachment to the Democratic Party, oftentimes, and in some cases even more than that. And that attachment is pretty consistent. We also know that African Americans, both in a relative and absolute sense, report a very strong attachment to their racial in-group. So if we ask African Americans the famous linked fate question, we see that upwards of 60-some-odd% of African Americans report some feeling of linked fate. Even higher than that, when we ask them how important is being Black to their racial identity. These are familiar features of Black politics. A sort of consistency and support for the Democratic Party and express loyalty and attachment to their racial in-group. But as Vince and others will tell you that for some time I've been trying to make the case that this sort of electoral and partisan homogeneity, this is not at all synonymous with political homogeneity, right? Insofar as African Americans think about and have attitudes about politics, we disagree quite often. So if you've ever sat at a dinner table with Black folks, you know this. If you've ever engaged Black folks, you know this. There's been no meeting where African Americans have decided how to think about any range of social policies. We disagree, and we disagree quite frequently. And where I want to focus our attention tonight in terms of this disagreement is that many African Americans support punitive social policies that target, monitor, police, and attempt to control and correct behaviors of in-group members. So that's a really fancy way of saying, or maybe not so fancy way of saying, that when we look at black public opinion, we find often that African Americans disagree, of course, about things like climate change, abortion, and the like. But I want to zero in tonight on the fact that African Americans disagree, with some having quite conservative issue preferences, on the kinds of policies that bear disproportionately on the lives of black people. Right? And so I think Michelle Alexander points this out quite nicely in her well-regarded book, The New Jim Crow, where she says, yet another notable difference between Jim Crow and mass incarceration is that many African Americans seem to support the current system of control, while most believe the same could not be said of Jim Crow. Catherine Tate and others have pointed out the fact that African Americans supported in high percentages Bill Clinton's welfare reform policies, even as African Americans were perceived as the targets of these policies. When we look at black attitudes about the death penalty, a social policy that disproportionately affects black and brown people in this country, we find that upwards of 40% of African Americans report supporting capital punishment. And in these two important texts, which I would recommend to all of you, we find evidence, great historical evidence of black support for the Rockefeller drug laws, which gave rise to the system of mass incarceration. We see in James Foreman's prize-winning book that African Americans are supportive of locking up their own, of these harsh, punitive, criminal social policies that disproportionately affect African Americans. I want to spend just a second talking about a policy that was implemented in Timmonsville, South Carolina, which is about 25 minutes away from where I grew up. Timmonsville is a majority black town. It's a small town, but it's a mostly black place. Has a black city council and a black mayor. And in 2016, it, like locales across the country, implemented this sagging pants policy. And it was a part of a broader ordinance, Ordinance 543, and this was the language of that ordinance. It shall be unlawful for any person driving or walking in the streets and roads of the town of Timmonsville to do a lot of things, including engaging in public nudity, but it should be unlawful for people in the town of Timmonsville to wear pants, trousers, or shorts such that the known undergarments are intentionally displayed or exposed to the public, right? And this is a policy that without question. So we might debate whether African Americans understand that some of these social policies bear disproportionately on members of their in-group. This policy, without question, is targeted at African American men, right? And it's implemented not by a conservative white city council or a white mayor, but instead is implemented by an all-black city council, a black mayor, and members of the town of Timmonsville aren't rallying in the street, joining the ACLU, and saying that this is a bad social policy, right? This policy is implemented without much sort of argumentation or disagreement from members in the town of Timmonsville. And I think this is interesting, and I think it signals this puzzling and underappreciated feature of our politics, that at times members of stigmatized groups support a range of punitive social policies that burden and target members of their own social group. So the question for us tonight is, how do we begin to make sense of this seeming paradox in our politics? Well, I want to do some evangelizing first, and then I'll get to the sort of theorizing that I'm going to put forth. I think first we need to pay more attention to the workings of identity beyond its role in maintaining out-group conflict. And so many of us in the room might be interested in the ways in which identity sort of structures conflict between blacks and whites, or gays and non-gays, Muslims and non-Muslims, right? I think we need to do some more work to think about the dynamics of identity within social groups. And this is the gospel that's been preached by Kathy Cohen for years now, that I'm going to raise again tonight, that we need to pay particular attention to the treatment of perceived deviance and transgressive or bad behavior within stigmatized groups. So Kathy's been holding up this gospel for a long time, and I hope that this work can be in conversation with that work, which calls our attention to the ways in which members of stigmatized groups treat and burden the more stigmatized members of those groups. So Vince is probably cringing. I'm going to move from the evangelizing to some theory and data. All right, so in short, we need to talk more about the politics of respectability and in-group policing. Right? We need to think about how these dynamics arise within these stigmatized groups. So I'm not going to do a long lit review today because we don't have time for that, but I do want to situate this work in a broader conversation and hopefully inspire you to go and check out some of these texts if you haven't already. And so what do we know? The phrase respectability politics comes from this seminal work by Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, a historian, who talks about respectability as emerging within the black church. And she's thinking about how members, particularly women, and the Black Baptist Church are responding to issues of discrimination toward the black community. And what she's talking about in this historical narrative is how these black women were preaching this gospel of respectability, how they were insisting on a kind of thriftiness, a sort of politeness, a sort of a demonstration that African Americans were deserving of equal treatment by whites. And so we see in Higginbotham's work this rich historical narrative about the rootings of respectability. And she's talking about it as being a response to discrimination that's targeting African Americans. And so Higginbotham gives us this sort of historical situating of respectability. Kathy and others have written about respectability as it emerges within the black community. Kathy's talking about it and hinting at it and the boundaries of blackness and wondering why we don't see this movement in service of black people affected by AIDS and HIV, writing that one of the reasons that we don't see this movement take hold is because there's a sort of sidelining of the most stigmatized members of this social group. And some of my colleagues now at Stanford, Thuron and Leighton, were writing about in-group policing and the comparative context, thinking about why it is members of various in-groups might worry about or tend to behavior within their social groups. They're making the argument that this is to sort of ward off or make sure that there's not a constant cycle of war between these social groups. And I'm hopeful that this work can bridge some of these divides and make these bits of scholarship talk to one another. And so the goals of this project and what we'll talk about tonight is I want to consider how the politics of respectability manifests in the minds of ordinary black people. And so we get this sort of rich historical narrative from Higginbotham. We're told in this work that it's in response to discrimination, it's in response to indiscriminate violence. Do ordinary black people think about the world this way? We find systematic evidence that this is how the world plays out. And because I'm trained here at Michigan, and I think that it's important to think about how people come to think about the social world as a function of their social identity, I want to examine the extent to which these various psychological and social factors affect individuals' embrace of respectability or their willingness to engage in this sort of in-group policing. And I want to test whether respectability, above and beyond these existing constructs, influences black public opinion, particularly around these issues of punitive social policies. So let's define our terms very quickly. We're going to think about respectability tonight as highlighting and scrutinizing behavior and comportment of in-group members, right? And we're going to think about this really in a framework that's inspired by the work of Higginbotham. And she's not using these terms, but we can think about it in this way, that individuals engage in this sort of in-group policing for a couple reasons. And I'm going to talk about them a little bit more on this next slide. But I want to convince you tonight that this engagement in in-group policing is inspired in part by a desire to maintain one's social identity, right, to respond to social identity threats, but that there are also some instrumental concerns that root the politics of respectability. And I promise I'll unpack what that means on this next slide. Just a really quick lesson in social identity theory before we get to some data. So Todgfell and Turner tell us that individuals belong to salient social groups and that we derive a sense of who we are from our membership or belonging in these salient social groups. And so something logically follows, right? That we care about how the group is viewed by others. And threats to the group image can affect our own sense of who we are. And so there are some Michigan grad students in the room tonight. I'm a Michigan grad student. We belong to the same identity group. Many of them are really hoping that I don't screw up, right? And they're hoping that I don't screw up, not just because they care about me, though I think some of them do, but because if I screw up, it makes them look bad, right? They have a range of emotions and feelings as a consequence of how I perform tonight, right? And so that's what this first bit is about, that we respond to these threats to social identity in part because how we think of ourselves is dependent on how people think about other members of our social group. But identities are about a lot more than emotions and egos, right? Identities affect outcomes. There's an instrumental sort of component of identities. And what I mean here is that stigmatization is often connected to this sort of indiscriminate meting out of consequences, right? Think about the history of enslavement in the U.S. White plantation owners or white slave owners are not just going to punish one person as a consequence of bad behavior. They're going to indiscriminately punish other members of that social group, right? And so maybe my friends from the Michigan grad program are concerned about how I perform not simply because it affects their ego, it affects their sense of self, right? But because they think that if Hakeem performs poorly, right, they're going to think that this is generally true about the social group to which we belong. And shit, being on the job market is already hard. And Hakeem has only made it more difficult, right? And so that's that instrumental component of identity that's often lost in a sort of simple theorizing about identity through the lens of ego and self-esteem. The argument tonight is that respectability and in-group policing is both about ego and self-esteem and also about these instrumental concerns about outcomes. Right? So just quickly, in-group policing within stigmatized groups has emotional, egocentric, but also instrumental roots. So a set of expectations follow here, and we'll go through these quickly, and then we'll talk about data. So we should expect that high identifiers are going to be more sensitive to threats, right? If I feel really strongly attached to a social group, I'm going to be more concerned when that identity group is threatened. If the identity is not important to me, I don't really care what people think of it. Right? We should also expect that African Americans who endorse more negative stereotypes about the group are going to be more likely to engage in this sort of in-group policing, adopting the politics of respectability. If I think that members of the group are already behaving well, there's not really anything to correct. We should also expect that shame, this feeling of embarrassment, this egocentric emotion, this self-directed emotion, is also going to correspond with the politics of respectability. And finally, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A, I expect that older African Americans, higher income blacks insofar as respectability is class, more religious blacks, those who are more authoritarian, based on this sort of instrumental concern, perceptions of discrimination should also correspond positively with the politics of respectability. And respectability should correspond with attitudes about punishment. Right? So let's talk about data. I'm going to present to you a new measure of respectability. So to test all of these expectations, we actually need a measure of respectability, something that we to date didn't have. I'm going to present the data tonight from a YouGov study that I ran thanks to a fellowship I received from the Center for Political Studies. This is 500 African Americans. These are the details of the sample. I want to talk first about how I constructed a measure of respectability. So I pilot tested this using MTurk samples and then confirmed it on the YouGov sample. But respondents initially had a 17-item battery of questions. And I'll just show you a sample of these on the screen. So these were some tough questions for people to answer. We can talk about that a little more in the Q&A. We were smart enough to randomize these questions so that responses or exposure to one of these items didn't make people so upset that they didn't want to follow through. And that was a really good idea because I had a few respondents in particular who did not like this question about hairstyles in the workplace, with one black woman saying in the Q&A, "Nobody tells me how to wear my hair." Fortunately, this doesn't survive factor analytic work, and so this is the respectability politics scale that we end up with here. How important is it that black people act responsibly in public, that they carry themselves in ways that others will respect, that they behave in ways that contribute to a positive image of the group? We ask how likely it is that black people would be treated better by society if members of their racial group behaved better. And the question is, if black people want to convince white people that they deserve equality, how important is it that members of the group behave better? We can talk more about this measure in Q&A and talk about some of the features of the construct, but the items have a pretty high inter-item correlation and perform pretty well in robustness checks. And so this is the distribution. We see here that there's a fairly high mean and median score, and again, we can talk about that. But if we're interested in how African Americans think about respectability, if we believe this measure I've constructed gets at it at least in part, we see that African Americans are fairly embracing of respectability, that this isn't some fringe belief among members of this social group. When we predict respectability or look at its correlates in a multivariate context, we see that older African Americans are indeed more embracing of respectability. Income doesn't matter in the way that we would expect, and I've used other measures of income, subjective wealth and income, and it still does not factor out. And as one who grew up in a fairly low middle-class family, my folks were really high in respectability. And so these values, I don't think, are as classed as we might think they are. We see here that authoritarianism, the child-rearing battery, which often doesn't map onto black attitudes when we look at things like partisanship, actually predicts respectability fairly well. We also see that those blacks for whom the identity is more important are more embracing of respectability. Linked fate doesn't map on as we'd expect. I have some thoughts about this that I'll save for the Q&A. Religiosity performs as expected. Perceptions of discrimination, so the more I perceive discrimination, the more I embrace respectability. Same for stereotypes. Shame is really powerful. So this item asks, when I think about how members of the group are viewed by others, how do you feel? And so those African Americans who report feeling more embarrassed or ashamed when they think about how the group is viewed by others are more likely to say that members of the group need to behave better. Now this anger item is confusing, right? But again, the question is, how do you feel when you think about how members of the group are viewed by others? So the way that I make sense of this is that they're angry, but not at members of the group. They're angry at those who hold these views. But again, we can talk about that more in the Q&A. So does this matter for how African Americans think about punitive social policies? And so what I did is I had a host of what we consider racialized social policies, and we're looking here to see if above and beyond existing constructs, this respectability politics scale that I've constructed maps on to black attitudes. And red's going to indicate that the relationship is significant at the 95% confidence level. And again, this is from multivariate models that control for everything, including linked fate and identity importance, right? And so this is a high burden. This respectability politics scale needs to perform above and beyond all of these usual suspects that we use to explain variation in black politics. So let's look at the first set of policies here. When we look at favoring sagging pants fines, so this is asking individuals how supportive they would be of a policy that fined individuals for sagging their pants in public. We see here that respectability politics performs above and beyond all of these existing measures, including authoritarianism. I asked about a support for military hair restrictions. We don't see anything there, and I think it's because these folks are already perceived to be fairly respectable, and that any policy implemented to sort of tell these folks what to do is thought of as discriminatory. This policy here was a question about whether one would support a policy that provided health care for a member of their community who had had a number of sex partners and then contracted an STD. We don't see any influence there. But we do when we ask about favoring welfare or work requirements for welfare, asking about broken windows policies, 3 strikes laws, asking about harsher drug sentencing. We see here that these folks who embrace respectability are more likely to think that the causes of gangs are more about cultural aspects like hip-hop music or poor parenting. This is significant at the 90% confidence level, but this is asked, how much sympathy do you have for rioters in Baltimore, right, who were arrested after the death of Freddie Gray? And I think more interestingly and perhaps troublingly, we see that those who are more embracing of respectability are more supportive of capital punishment and the death penalty. I'm going to speed through here just some experimental results. And I know that's dangerous to speed through experimental results, but I want to just share with you really quickly an attempt at getting at how African Americans are thinking about punishment in a particular context. And then I'll turn it over to Nate and we can continue the conversation. So I ran a recent MTurk experiment where African American respondents are introduced to 3 different conditions. And let me just walk you through what that looked like. So they're told that it's a Friday night and they're eager to see a movie, and these teenagers come into the theater, and these teenagers are causing a bit of a ruckus. And depending on the condition, the teenagers are described as black, white, or no race is mentioned, right? And so the expectation here is that African Americans' willingness to punish members of their in-group should be predicted by feelings of shame and embarrassment or by these sort of instrumental concerns that I've laid out earlier in the talk. And so first I asked, if you found yourself in this situation, having witnessed the behavior of these teenagers, how embarrassed or ashamed would you feel? Right? These are all African American respondents. Perhaps as expected, we see that they feel the most shame in the black teens condition. So African Americans who are told that black teenagers are behaving poorly are the ones who report the most feeling of shame and embarrassment, right? Does that make sense? But when asked how angry they feel, we see here that they're most angered by the behavior of white teens, right? They're more pissed off that these white teenagers have interrupted the film, right? So shame and anger are distinct emotions. Again, we can talk about that in the Q&A. But this was my attempt at getting at this instrumental bit. I asked, how difficult will it be for people like the teens to be welcomed in the theater in the future, given the teenagers' behavior? So black people think that the black teens make it much more difficult for people like the black teens, right, than white teens make it for people like them. So white people aren't going to be terribly affected by the behavior of white teenagers. It's not going to be more difficult in the eyes of these black people for white people to be invited into the theater in the future based on these teenagers' behavior. I think in the no race mention condition, people are having different conceptions about who these teenagers are, and so we see a little murkiness here that perhaps you can help me puzzle through in the Q&A. But we see this real difference between black teenagers and white teenagers, right? But what predicts punishment, right? Is it shame? So I have this question that asks, how fair would it be to escort these teenagers out of the theater? What you should pay attention to here is that shame isn't distinguishing punishment for the black teens, nor is it for the white teens or the no-race teams. So insofar as is punishment in this particular context is about emotion. Shame doesn't seem to be doing much work here, right? Doesn't seem to be much about shame. But is it driven by these more instrumental concerns, right? So does this feeling that blacks are going to have a more difficult time being welcomed into the theater predict punishment in the way that we might expect? We see here that, in fact, it does, right? So it's only in the black teen's condition that perceptions of difficulty for people like the teens, so black people in this case, right? So the more I believe that these black teenagers are making it more difficult for people like the black teens, black people like me, the more punitive I am, the more likely I am to say that it's appropriate to send them out of the theater. These perceptions don't matter when the teens are white or when the teens are no race, right? And just very quickly, we see the same here. This is a small difference, but it is significant. When we ask, is it appropriate to call the police on the teens if they continue behaving poorly in the parking lot? Again, these perceptions of difficulty for members of the group don't matter for white teens, doesn't matter when the teen's race isn't described, but it does matter for black teens, right? So these instrumental concerns are predicting punishment, but only when the teens are of the same race as these respondents. And I'm not going to give the takeaways. I'm going to end here, and we can talk more in the Q&A, and I'll pass it over to Nate.